We're gonna change the drone battery. I guess I was wrong. I thought this was going to get double throwdown, but it became glaringly obvious that it already has double throwdown. I know it's going back to Evo, maybe for an update. I guess this has been put on there for about 10 years. But it's a very nice Jeep. Heavy, as usual. The LT pulls it like a champ. Looks like it's got some older Dynatracs in it, bead locks. Got the PSC reservoir, Motec battery tray, coolant bottle, AC Delco radiator cap, quad header Motec radiator. Got a Penstar trans cooler, which is doing a pretty darn good job. This winch is sunk pretty good. It is a power plant, so I would definitely remove the power plant and put a regular winch on there, and then put the compressor inside as we discussed. Got a sizable ram down here with a ram skid, Dynatrac axles. Looks like he's got RCVs in it. Nice Jeep. He's gonna have a lot of fun with this one. And I'll tell you, the LT just makes these things fun to drive. It takes it from the little grocery getter V6 that sounds like a nasally little Honda to what it looks like. Got a lot of power, it sounds great, and you're not going to be embarrassed on the highway trying to hold the speed limit. So we're going to continue on down the trail. Today we're in a late JK with a LT1 L86, not sure which, but it runs great, 10 speed, you know, the whole 9 yards. This Jeep, I do believe, is going over to Evo when it leaves here for a double throwdown or coilovers or something. And it's going to be a really nice Jeep. This Jeep was built a while ago by this customer, I guess. He just got around to doing the motor. And I think he was trying to duplicate Moby, and that's kind of what he's going to get over at Evo. You can see that the ABS light is on, and this has Dynatrac axles. So my assumption is it's got a bad wheel speed sensor up front. But I get a lot of questions like, what do I need if I put an LT1 in? What drive shafts? What transfer case? Do I have to beef things up? And the answer is basically yes and no. If you have a relatively stock JK on stock tires, and yes, we've done LT1s in those, you can get away with the stock transfer case, and you could probably even get away with stock axles if you drive it normal. I've got 100,000 miles on my Rubicon with a 6.2 LS, and it has the stock 44s in it, and the press wasn't nice to it 10 years ago, and I haven't done anything to those axles. But then, of course, you get the guy that drives like a maniac, and you can break a Dana 60 with a V6. So a lot of it comes down to how you drive. But I'm going to talk about what I think is normal. Now, if you got a Jeep like this on 40s, it's heavy. You got a 6.2 LT, which is capable of producing tremendous torque at the bottom end. Then you want to beef up the drivetrain. So let's start with the axles. Probably a 60 will do everything you need. But if you really, really want to be sure, you're going to go out and climb rock waterfalls and floor it in 4-low and spin the tires and all that. Because a lot of guys don't realize that when you're not in 4-low, if you're in 4-high, 2-high, the electronic stability program tries to eliminate skid or wheel spin. So you're not only fighting torque management, but you're also fighting active braking. The GM powertrains have torque management built in for anti-clunk, like when it shifts, for axle protection, it limits the amount of torque put out. And if you leave all that active, odds are you're going to be safe. You take all that stuff out. We had a 5.3 LT a while back, and we removed all of the torque management and did a little bit of tuning on it just to see what we can get out of it, and we were surprised. We actually scattered an ARB unit in that vehicle because off the line it hooked up. It only had 35s on it, but in the summer in Vegas it hooked up and it broke the ARB. So that's how much power these things are capable of, and who knows what's going to come out with this new Gen 6. I'm hoping they go the route of more bottom end torque rather than higher RPM and revving, because the LTs now are diesel-like as it is. So with that low RPM torque off the line, you have more chance of breaking stuff. So let's start with the transfer case. The stock transfer case is probably fine. That's the 241J, and I'll say this again, I know it's confusing and it's been said many times before, but in our conversion you can run a 241J from a 7 to 18 manual transmission JK or a 7 to 11 automatic transmission JK. And the reason that is, in 2012 when Chrysler went to the WA580, they reversed the input shaft of the transfer case. They went from a female to a male, so it's a goofy setup. Now that transfer case we found is fine with the LS and the LT with, let's say, 35-inch or less tires for a guy that drives normal. Even 37s. I've got guys on 40s driving around with that combination, 6.2 LTs, and they just drive normal and they've got tens of thousands of miles on their JK. Now I have seen a couple of failures with LT 6.2s and stock transfer cases when guys are running on 40s to 43s and they go out and they beat them up. Especially when they have full skids, which traps the heat in. I think I've seen 1 or 2 failures. So you say, well, what's my option? Well, of course you got a lot of options, but the most popular is going to be the Atlas. And there's a couple of different Atlases you can get. The standard Atlas that we use, and if you call Advanced Adapters, talk to Steve Roberts, is going to be the Atlas 2 Motec, or the Motec Atlas 2. It's going to come pre-configured for our conversion. There is a 8-speed, 10-speed, and a 6-speed. The difference being the front clocking ring on the Atlas, I think. But in any event, you call Steve Roberts, say you're doing a Motec conversion, and what he'll do is set it up with the vehicle speed delete, the oil sight tube, the front input clocking ring and gear, just everything that it needs for it to be compatible with our swap. That transfer case, I'm going to say a year or two ago, was like $3,200 retail. The prices have been going up almost on a monthly basis, so I think that transfer case now is about $3,700. The other option is going to be the heavy-duty Motec Atlas. Basically the same transfer case, except it's been beefed up. I think they're using a race case, heavy-duty pins and gears. I don't know what they do to it, but that transfer case is $4,500, maybe $4,700 now. Again, call Steve, he'll set it up for you. We put those heavy-duty Atlases behind supercharged engines and high RPM 600 horsepower LSs with no issue. I will say we do not recommend the Atlas 4 because we don't think it's required, unless you have a special need for it. But there are considerations for that. Your braking system, for one. If you do a 5-to-1 transfer case in an LT 6.2, even at an idle, that thing has so much torque, you're going to have a hard time stopping it. You're going to want to throw it in neutral or beef up your brakes. Go to Hydro Boost or something. Which brings me back to the gearing. What we find is the 3-to-1 transfer case is optimal for most guys. With 3-to-1 transfer case, you can pretty much run down the trails in comfort in 4 low. You can go 45 miles an hour without screaming the engine. Now, to be realistic with these LTs, you're going to be in 4 high most of the time. The main reason I go into 4 low is if I'm going down a steep hill, I don't want to overspeed, I put it in 4 low. But as far as going up hills go, the LT really doesn't care. So you're going to be in 4 high most of the time. Well, guys say, oh, I don't want to lose my Rubicon transfer case because of low gearing. Well, the Rubicon transfer case with a V6 is about 12-to-1 low ratio. You're going to 18-to-1 and you're going to a V8 with extra firing pulses, more torque, all that. Now, if you do have a special need because you trailer your Jeep to the trail and you're going to go up riverbeds really slow and you want to run a 4.3, a 5.0, you know, go ahead, but what you're going to find is a lot of the low-end gearing is just going to be useless. Remember, what GM went for in the LT was that low-end torque, diesel-like performance, which I love. If you got a Hemi, a 6.4, or what was it, the old 6.0, you had to rev the thing up to $5 or $6 grand to get it in its power band, and I don't like that in a Jeep. I like to have that low-end grunt like a diesel truck. So a 3-to-1 Atlas would be a great upgrade, and I have several videos on transfer cases. You say, what else do I get for that $3,000 or $4,000? What you get is a twin stick, so you can control the front and rear axles independently. You can put the front axle in high, low, or neutral, and the same in the rear. You say, why would you want to do that? Well, in snow, you might want front-wheel drive for better steering and release the rear. If you're going down switchback trail where you got to constantly turn the wheel, but you want low ratio because you're going up a steep hill or you're just going slow, you can go into 2-wheel drive low. Engage the rear axle in low, disengage the front axle, which you can't do with a 241J. Once you put that lever into 4 high, both axles are driving at that point. So then your steering is going to be stiffer. It's going to have more wear on the drivetrain and all that, because now not only do you have the left and right friction of the axles, but you have the front to rear. So if you lock the transfer case, now you're spinning up the gears inside the axles. And remember, the JK doesn't have unlocking front hubs from the factory, so you don't have that option of unlocking the front axle. And I have noticed that when you go into two-wheel drive low, the steering is a lot freer, and you actually get better economy too, because you're not fighting all that friction in the powertrain. So the Atlas is going to give you a couple of extra modes. Now, is it worth it? And my answer is yes and no. If you do a lot of wheeling and you do technical stuff, the Atlas is worth its weight in gold. Some guys swear by going into front digs and disengaging the rear on some of these rock climbs where you have a lot of traction, like out here in Red Rock or Logandale. We've seen the front end of Jeeps come up and flip over. So by going into front dig and pulling yourself up that hill instead of pushing, that can be an advantage, but that's pretty advanced stuff. For most of us, just going with a 241J works just fine. Because remember, if you have a Rubicon or locking axles and you engage that transfer case into four-wheel drive, that's as much traction as you're ever going to get. All four wheels are locked together. So you're not going to get any more traction with an Atlas, but what you're going to get is other modes that allow you to do what you want more easily. Drive shafts. I always recommend that you upgrade your drive shafts. Even with the LS 6.0, 6.2, the RZEPAs are okay, and they can handle angularity pretty good with low vibration, but having some heavy-duty CVs with a V8, larger tires, heavy JKs, a lot of stress in the drive shaft. I've seen them break, I've seen them twist, so if you can afford the drive shafts, get them. Now you may have to, and this is a short explanation, but when your JK's on the ground, let's say you don't have a lift, those drive shafts are pretty much in a neutral position. They have splines that go in and out. Once you raise that JK up, if you don't change the control arms and push the axles back, it's going to suck the axles inward. So now let's say you suck your axle inward an inch, and you can stand next to your Jeep and look at it and see if the wheels are centered in the wheel well. And then you put a LS, LT, Hemi, whatever in. In our conversion with the LS, you're moving the transfer case back about an inch, and maybe an inch and a half with the LT. It's not a lot, but combined with the fact that you have a lift and not adjustable control arms, it just might be enough to where you're going to get drive shaft binding. So that's something you have to check if you want to run the RZEPAs. But honestly, if you're going to spend 20 grand plus for a V8 conversion, just get some upgraded drive shafts and have that ease of mind. Adams down here, they used to do the drive shafts for $1,000, then it was $1,100. I think it's now $1,200 or $1,300, and you can't complain about it because they use all American Spicer parts. They don't take any shortcuts. They do mail order. All you got to do is give them a couple of dimensions and they'll ship the things right to your door. So that's my advice on the drive shafts. Now I'm going to address the air compressor because some of you guys might have ARB lockers, and pretty much everybody's going to want to air down their tires for a trail and then air back up. So an air compressor is almost a necessity. Yeah, you can have CO2 bottles and all that on your Jeep, and a lot of guys do. But what we see mostly is the ARB dual, and sometimes the ARB single, and guys mount it mostly on top of the brake booster. I don't recommend you mount it on top of the brake booster, and there's several reasons. One, it takes up a lot of real estate in the engine compartment you could use for something else. Two, underhood temps, especially here in the Southwest, can get up to 300 degrees plus. And when you want to air up a 40-inch tire, or 4 of them, the duty cycle of that compressor is going to be reduced dramatically. I've seen guys run the dual ARBs in the desert, and they're hooked up to their ARBs, and they're driving along, and the ARB is leaking, and that compressor is running constantly, and I've seen the supply cables go into that compressor and catch on fire. So it's just something you don't need. Plus, being mounted right there on the brake booster, we find that it's a little bit louder and noisier than mounting it somewhere else. So where's our preferred location? Under the passenger seat. Under the passenger seat, we actually find that it's quieter, it stays cooler, so the duty cycle remains higher, and the longevity of the compressor is just going to be that much more. And as far as the plumbing goes, it's just easier there. You can plumb up your ARB lockers front to rear and inflate your tires. I don't know if you guys have seen the Made for Rock air system, but that's where they put their stuff, and you just need short hoses going out to the tires rather than having to go from the front of the vehicle to the back. So when it comes to an air compressor, get what you want, but my advice is mount it inside the cab. Now here's probably one of the most troublesome things, and that's the S-Pod type device. Now I'm not saying S-Pod is bad, it's not, they're good. For the first decade of the JK, they were pretty much a mainstay. The reality is guys are going to have lights and lockers and compressors and whatever else you want to operate with a switch. So the S-Pod is a convenient thing. Now the S-Pod is kind of dated in my opinion. The old switch bank, in fact, I don't know if you can see it, but this Jeep has one. The switch bank is somewhat cumbersome to use, but more importantly, that metal box out there is large. You have large diameter cables carrying a lot of current going from the battery on the passenger side of the engine compartment all the way over to the front driver's side of the engine compartment. And I'm not a big fan of that because the longer the distance, the higher the resistance, the more the heat. So that wire turns into a resistor. I've seen fuses blow. I've seen the insulation melt and drip off the wires. I just don't like it. I'm going to slow down here a little because the wind is really howling and I don't know if you can hear me. So what we prefer is a unit that mounts near or on top of the battery. Of course, S-Pod offers their little Bantam unit. Switch Pros has really become popular. ProComp, eBay, everybody's selling them now. 4 channels, 6 channels, 8 channels. Get whatever you need, but don't get more than you need. Try to keep it clean. Now the nice thing about that setup is you have these really short cables going to the battery, maybe a foot long. That's a lot better than 6 or 8 feet. The unit is small, maybe the size of a large cigarette box, and it's not taking up a lot of real estate in the engine compartment. You run a simple cable inside and plug it into a panel. Now, there's different panels, but most of them, I call them credit card panels because they're not much bigger than that, and most of them have simple push buttons. Some of them are touch screen that you can assign a function. Front locker, rear locker, compressor, light, whatever. Some of them are Bluetooth. I'm not a big fan of that. I don't know why you gotta have a Bluetooth when you're sitting right next to it. Really the only time I think you might need a Bluetooth is with a winch operation, like you're stuck in the mud and you gotta get out of the vehicle and operate the winch. But I don't see too much need if I'm sitting in the vehicle to have Bluetooth to a switch panel that I'm sitting next to. Some of you guys might have a need for it. I don't know. You can comment on that. Maybe you have it hooked up to your alarm and you can remote start it or Windows or whatever you want to do. Turn your lights on in a parking lot. But that's my advice. Get a small, clean, simple unit you can install with the least amount of grief, takes up the least amount of real estate, and keeps the wiring to a minimum. Then, of course, do the wiring to the unit clean. That's where we see most of the issues with these conversions. Wires being run on top of the exhaust, or rubbing through the fan, or some other mechanical component, the belt. Keep the wiring clean. Now, I do believe this Jeep is getting a double throwdown, and we see the bolt-on coilovers, weld-on coilovers, long arms, mid-arms. We just see all sorts of different crazy suspension systems. And I'm not going to get into that today because it's a whole nother video, but I would say about 20% of the suspension systems we see installed on vehicles are done correctly. Most of the rest of the time, they're done incorrectly. The vehicles wander, towing is wrong, so they're darting around, caster is wrong, so the wheel doesn't center, you're crabbing going down the road. So my advice is if you don't need a long arm, stay with a mid-arm. And the reason is it's so much easier to bolt mid-arms on, and the JK is a mid-arm. And we got technology out there now. It's not like a short arm like a TJ. So you can get a lot of travel out of a stock JK suspension system that'll probably handle most of us. Now yes, the guys that are gonna go out and run whoopie-doos and pre-run or do extreme rock crawling might need that articulation. But for the rest of us, if we run a mid-arm and you use technology like the Metacloak, what do they call it? The Duraflex joint that rotates in the housing. And we'll get into the technology of that at some point. I'm not an expert on suspension, but I do have experience with it. Those systems allow more flex because they allow the rubber joint to rotate in the housing and not tear. So the need for a long arm is not as dramatic because a long arm, if you want to sell center with a rubber joint, the long arm's going to give you a longer travel with the same arc, the same amount of degrees arc. Now the Metacloak joint has been copied. I think the TerraFlex Arctic arms and some others, Synergy maybe, are doing it also, so you have a lot of choice out there. But the deal is, if you bolt that suspension system on and you make all the control arms equal length to each other side to side, the odds are you're going to have really good success in making that work right. Once you start cutting off control arm brackets and welding on new brackets and long arms and going to the cross member and all that, it really does add a layer of complexity. And that's where we see a lot of guys lose it and just don't know how to set it up, or brackets are welded on wrong, and we've actually had to cut brackets off many times to correct. So staying with the mid arm, you're pretty safe. If you need the long arm, there's a need there, get it, of course. But the mid arm, in my experience, works for most of us. Now, while we're talking about suspension, hydraulic steering is a must for a lot of Jeeps. If you got 40-inch tires, you're pretty much going to need hydraulic steering, and there's a couple of reasons. We've actually done bills with 40s and no hydraulic steering, and guys are just driving around in the street. But the bottom line is it puts a lot of strain on the steering components. When you got a 40-inch tire, all that stress from turning that tire is going into the drag link, the spindle, and then up to the steering gear. And the steering gear has to take that force. And we've had Jeeps that were death wobbling because the frame was flexing because there was so much stress. So by putting a hydraulic ram on, what you're doing is you're putting all that stress between the axle housing and the tie rod, and none of that gets up to the steering gear. So that's why it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to get a big bore box and a hydraulic ram. Yes, that probably would be the ultimate setup, but really at that point the steering gear is nothing more than a control valve, and all the stress is being taken up by that hydraulic ram. So my basic rule is if you got 35s or under, you're probably pretty much okay with a stock setup. Now, I have had guys with 35s and mainly with 37s getting a death wobble, and they can't fix it. They got brand new axles, brand new smart steering components and synergy and all this stuff, and they still have death wobble. And it's a science, it's not an art. I've had them come in, and it could be anything from low tire pressure, balancing your tires, an alignment problem. I've had the best shops check out some of this death wobble. It doesn't do it for 6 months. You hit a tar strip on the freeway just at the right speed, just at the right angle, and it'll set that 37 off like a harmonic, like one of them tuning forks. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you come to a stop. I don't know one cure for death wobble, but what I do know is adding a ram kills most death wobble, because now all those components have been taken out of the equation. You're no longer going through the ball joints and the drag link and the steering gear and the frame flex and all that. So what I would say is if you got 35s, maybe 37s, and your only issue is death wobble, you can add a small hydraulic ram like Redneck Ram. There's no reason to go full-blown PSC and spend all that money. They will port your gearbox, and they will give you the hoses and a 1.5-inch ram. The smaller the ram, the better, because you're not really looking to push 40s. What you're looking to do is stabilize the steering, and we find that the 1.5-inch ram does just fine. Now, if you do get up into the heavy 37s, 40s plus, then of course you're going to want to upgrade to hydraulic steering for obvious reasons. Auxiliary fuel tanks. This can be a sore subject for some of us, but a necessity for others. The auxiliary fuel tanks, depending on how you set them up, are going to give you extra range. And of course, that's more convenient than putting jerry cans on your Jeep. Let's just say you go with some of the popular setups out there. There's several considerations. One is legality. If you're in a place like California and you put in a rear-mounted fuel tank, the odds are it's not going to be legal. It's not set up to support the evap system. And I don't want to go into detail, but just know that it's not set up to properly vent the fuel tank. On top of that, the sending unit always isn't accurate, meaning they're usually camel hump tanks, and the fuel pump sits in the lower portion of the tank, so you really can't read the top of the tank, which isn't that big of a deal because you need to read the bottom of the tank, right? Now, I do long distance driving, so I want to know what the top of the tank is, because that can kind of give me an indication of how much is remaining on the tank, mileage wise. That's not a big deal to you. That's just something you're going to have to deal with on some of these aftermarket tanks. Probably one of the biggest issues with these aftermarket tanks is filling the tank, because they're not vented properly in most of these tanks. In fact, I don't know of any of them. Motec may offer its own tank with a fill valve. And what the fill valve does is when you start pushing fuel into it and there's that differential pressure, it drops a fill valve that opens the tank directly up to the evap canister so that you can fill quickly. You can put the pump on high. I have been standing in a gas station for 15-20 minutes filling up a fuel tank, just dripping the fuel in, because that's as fast as I can put it in. And you got a $100,000 Jeep and you got to sit there and drip the fuel in. It's a little bit embarrassing, but it's not that big of an inconvenience, but that's just what you're going to have to deal with. Now, that's not the only setup. You got the Long Ranger tanks. There's one that goes on the left side, Moto-Built. There's a lot of other tanks, but do your diligence. And if you do an auxiliary fuel tank, be careful with the wiring. Now, in the old days, some of these suppliers of these tanks, you had dual tanks, let's say. Let's say you kept your JK tank on the passenger side, you installed a rear tank. Now you got a couple of ways to do it. One way to do it is to put 2 JK pumps in and then have a switch that you can switch between the tanks. Another way is to have a feeder pump go from the rear tank to the main tank and then just feed off the main tank. But whatever you do, make sure you beef up the wiring. We actually saw harnesses where they would plug into the stock JK fuel pump connector, run that all the way forward to a switch, and then back to the rear tank. And you're talking 25, 30 feet of relatively small gauge wire. And as you can imagine, there were fuel feed issues with that setup. What I would do in that setup is run 2 relays right off the battery and feed each pump its power right from the battery, and don't go through all that hogwash with the running all the wires forward, the feed wires forward. Now you can use the same switch to trigger the relay, but don't have the power wires going through that switch on the dash. I kind of like the old gravity tanks. My Toyota has one. It was mounted above the spare tire, and it's because it's above the level of the main tank, it just gravity feeds into that main tank, and there's really no electronics involved. Ford used to have those selector valves that was switch controlled, very troublesome. They were like pushover valves where it had to get pressure from one of the pumps, and don't get mixed up with that stuff. We have seen some back feeding of the fuel where it bleeds pressure off if you try to tap them into the same fuel line, but I don't want to get into that. That'll be another video. So really what I'm saying in this video, and it's getting long, so I'm going to cut it off and we'll have a part 2, is when you start adding these things, whether it's axles, drive shafts, transfer cases, get what you need. Don't get what you want necessarily. It's more important you get what you need and keep it simple. Now, what you want might be different. You might want all this whiz-bang stuff, but we see Jeeps that are so pimped out, I wouldn't take them off-road. They got stuff falling off of them, just crawling through the mall. You don't want that. You want something that's clean, efficient, and minimalistic if you're going to do hard off-roading. Now, if you are going to stay mostly on the street, you're a weekend warrior, you're going to go out and run a trail here and there, get what you want. Get what makes you happy. But I can tell you, I've seen Jeeps with stuff on it that the guy has never used. He was sold a bill of sale at a shop. Oh, you're going to need this device that has 12 different rock lights on it, and it's built into your mirror, and that'll double as a this and a that. Most of these guys don't even use that stuff. If you're going to use it, that's great. If you're not going to use it, then it shouldn't be there, in my opinion. So this video's gone a little bit long. We're going to take this awesome LT 6.2 10 speed on this trail, and we're going to be back. We got some really cool stuff coming up.